Welcome to IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Don.
Coming at you live from San Francisco, California.
You're watching IT Pro TV.
Welcome to another great episode here at IT Pro TV. I'm your host, Cherokee Boos. In this episode, we're going to be looking at CompTIA's Project Plus, and we're going to be explaining communication triggers. With us today, we have Sir Ronnie Wong. Thank you for coming today, Ronnie.
Well, thank you for having me back here as we take a look at CompTIA Project Plus, and we are continuing on taking a look at some of our communication factors, and we're actually on that particular point in our shows where we're also up to, well, talking about communication triggers. Now, you might hear that word, you might hear that term, but you're not exactly sure what we mean by that. So we actually normally deal with it in two particular contexts in project management. When we start talking about triggers, the first context that you deal in terms of triggers is the idea of risk management, okay? And what we want to actually have when we deal with in the realm of risk management is the very fact that we want to have some type of forewarning that a risk is about to take place or is actually happening as it goes on. So we talk about this idea of being what we call a risk trigger as well, okay? The other places that we also need to address this is in terms of communication plans and patterns as well, and that's what we also want to indicate too. That what we should have is this ability to have certain things inside of our project itself that really does trigger us to actually have more communications or to actually have proper communications that are in place to make sure that the information that we need is related to the right people at the right time and for the right reason. So normally when we talk about communications triggers, we normally need to identify who's going to be the actual audience, okay? And also how often are we actually talking about something like this happening as well. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we understand the rationale or the reason behind this being a trigger and what it really needs to help us to do. Now, you might be wondering, why do we need that? Because we don't want it to be something in which catches us off guard. We want to make sure that we understand that if these events that we're about to talk about end up happening, that there should be some type of communication that goes on so that everybody is on the same page or understands that something is supposed to occur next. So normally when we have that, that's what we want to happen. Okay, so that's what we're going to take a look at when we start talking about the idea of triggers. Okay, the entire goal of setting up a trigger is the same way that we set one up for the idea of managing risk, right? Is to help us to anticipate what is about to happen. Now, in communication triggers, even though we can talk about them in terms of risks management, a lot of times is to really indicate that we're moving on from whatever has just happened and that we're supposed to be proceeding. We're not supposed to be going back and rehashing it again and rethinking it. In project management, because time has to be managed as a resource, you also have to think about that still progress has to continue on and that we need this. So we want to make sure that we can identify what those triggers are and then, of course, talk about what controls actually need to go on or what has to happen when we find these things triggering the actions that they need to. So we want to start taking a look, and we've got, I don't know, quite a few of them that we need to go through, about 10 or 11 different types of triggers here. But let's make sure we do cover all of them to ensure that we understand what's happening. Okay?
Sure, let's go ahead and take a look at the first one we have here. It looks like audits.
Yes, so when we start talking about the idea of auditing, okay, any time that you have an audit that goes on, you've got to understand the purpose of the audit itself. Okay, and normally who audits are actually going to be, given for as well. So sometimes audits are demanded, right? When something goes wrong with inside of our project and we're not sure what has happened here, we may call for an audit, and that way they can actually discover what should have happened versus what did happen. So it might be where it is actually an on-call thing. But the other thing that we can do is just have a regularly scheduled audit in terms of something that's very periodic, that happens on a regular basis to ensure that we're still tracking the right way as well. Okay? And the reason why we need an audit system of some sort, right, is because without this, we might not know that we're way out of bounds, let's say on cost management at some point, but we might find out that, hey, the audit's going okay, but we still need more details on this so that we get a better and fuller picture. And so even though audits are something that we don't like to hear about because it makes us having to go back and address things like compliance issues sometimes, spending issues that we have to have, or record keeping issues, it is something that is good for us because it actually keeps us on track. So when we start thinking about that, who is normally the audit for when it's called for? Well, normally it's going to be the project manager himself. Okay, the PM is normally who's going to actually be given the audit as far as the report goes, and even the project sponsor and sometimes the stakeholders, depending on where they are in the project or where in the project they are as far as the progress goes. And the whole goal behind most of the general regular periodic types of audits is to track the spending, is to track whether requirements are actually getting done, is to track whether or not we're actually still on time to be able to do everything that we need to. So in that sense, right, what is an audit doing in terms of triggering? Okay, well, it could actually trigger where we're supposed to have action. Okay, and normally most auditors' reports end up telling us that. Okay, is that here's our audit, we find everything actually in good standing, but you may see where they also have what they call recommendations that need to be made. And so normally the idea behind that is you actually implement those recommendations in a timely fashion or in a regular fashion so that next time an audit occurs, those things are actually taken care of. So usually that's what we see in terms of a communication type of trigger. So this is where the project manager gets that report and he actually has that communication. And then the project manager says, here's what our budget auditors said, or here's what our time auditors said. Here's where we actually are in the scope and what we need to do to get back on track. And so that it triggers then the project manager to either request more resources or to get back to managing his project teams and saying, hey, here's what needs to be done. So auditing itself, right, and doing audits is a type of trigger that should lead to some type of response like that when we start taking a look.
Great. So that's auditing. Next up is project planning.
Yeah. So the project planning, of course, is by far the largest part of everything that we talk about in the CompTIA Project Plus show that we're doing here. And the reason why is it really is. The project plan itself is kind of the guidebook, the overall standard that we must follow and compliance that we must follow to ensure that everything happens. Okay. So normally once we get the charter on hand, this is when we begin to work on every aspect of planning out the management of our project. Okay. Now the neat thing about this is that it actually does happen based off of a trigger as well. So project planning itself, its trigger is once we actually get the project charter signed, that's when the planning part begins. We don't begin the planning and then get the project charter. We normally get the charter first and then the planning of the project management begins at that particular point. Now, once we have that project plan in hand, and it's actually been now reviewed usually by the project manager as well as maybe subject matter experts who contribute some information, and even the project champion giving us some technical guidance on what also needs to occur to make sure that the entire project scope is met. We also end up seeing then that the project plan itself becomes a trigger that once it's now signed off on and everybody agrees, that is when the execution phase itself and the monitoring and controlling can also begin too. So inside that project planning, what we hope to happen as well is that maybe we've addressed some of the risk issues that may have happened, but overall though we have a plan for it, and that's what we also want to see. So project planning is something else that can lead to a trigger, and usually for us that trigger is, again, beginning the project itself in terms of execution and controlling.
Well, what about whenever there's any kind of change to the project? How would that go ahead and affect the overall communication?
Well, in this sense, right, a project change, it should lead to probably the most detailed level of communication that we are going to have about something that is about to happen. And the reason why is once we have a plan on hand, right, and everybody's been reviewing the plan, everybody's been talking about it, they have an idea of what they want to see at the end. Now, if somebody says, I need to submit a change ticket, well, at that particular point, it doesn't mean that everybody understands how that change is going to occur, how it's going to happen, or even why it's going to happen. So whenever we have a project change, it may change the entire scope of the project itself. And when you have something like that, okay, it happens during the time when we're normally executing and controlling the project, okay? So that means what work has already been done up in that point, and now somebody goes, oh, wait a minute, before we move on, I've got to actually initiate some type of change. And if we don't have good communication about it, that means the change that ends up happening for us may continue, okay, to actually go on, and all of a sudden now a little requirement that we thought nobody would notice if I made a slight tweak on myself, by myself, and nobody else mentioned it, now actually affects the rest of the project too. So instead, what we want to make sure that we understand is that any type of project change should trigger a communication to whoever's actually responsible for the succeeding task, I can't say it, succeeding task of whatever that change is going to be, and also who's going to implement that change, and also the idea of what we call a regression plan as well, in which it gives us steps to back out of it if the change that we choose to implement isn't actually working the way that we think it should. So project changes normally are going to be targeted for just about every stakeholder. Usually the project sponsor may also be a part of it. If it actually affects the entire project scope, the project manager needs to understand what's going to happen so that he realizes he needs to adjust for timing, scheduling, and of course resources to be available for the change too. So there's a lot that goes on here, but this type of thing, of course, is what leads us, once we actually get that project change approved, leads us to changing the project itself. So that is another type of trigger. In other words, we shouldn't just get a change ticket and go, okay, change ticket, big deal, toss it onto a stack of papers, and the change doesn't happen, okay? So it should lead us to actually implementing some sort of change and making sure that we are communicating that it is happening so everybody is on the same page in terms of where the project is heading.
Now, how do risk register updates fall into this situation as triggers?
Yeah, this is actually very important, especially when we start dealing with the idea of risk, because naturally, that is where we tend to also have triggers. We want to make sure that we have the idea of what we can anticipate in the future as a risk. Well, we might have encountered one risk then that has now demonstrated to us, okay, that what we have to actually have on hand is something else that's about to happen. So the risk register essentially gives us that idea, okay, and then we come up with a risk score in which we can now rate, and then we start taking that score, taking a look at our schedule, and then we can anticipate when we expect to see that risk occur. Now the problem is this, right, is because we're now already implementing execution and controlling during this particular point, updating it means that you've got to realize that change is going to happen during the project, and that the more risks that happen, the more changes that are going to go on there. So what we want to do is make sure that we have an appropriate plan, and that what ends up happening is that we do have a risk management plan that's going to help us as we anticipate these changes. So it should not be where we just make an ad hoc or an on-the-fly type of response to the risk, but it's something in which we should have already addressed on how we want that change to be managed, that risk to be managed a little bit better, and that is also going to help us out in this instance of making sure everybody understands that here it is. The risk register essentially is a trigger whenever we update it, because it means everybody needs to understand what has changed as far as the risk goes as the project develops. Okay?
Great. Next up, we have milestones.
Yeah. Now, a project milestone essentially is an event that happens for our project that really has no duration at all. So it doesn't cost us any real time resources or monetary resources. It is actually set there inside of our project plan to indicate it is a good time to review, okay, usually for a reason. Now, the reason is whether or not we want to continue forward, or whether we want to stop the project as well. And we'll start talking about what we call project gate reviews or something a little bit later on too. Now,
Yeah, I
normally,
was going to say, this term sounds pretty familiar, like a toll gate
Yep.
or, okay.
yeah, it's actually the same when you start talking about milestones, toll gates, go no go decisions.
Just depending on what vendor you're talking with.
Yeah, what particular project management style that you learned it.
Okay.
But here, when we start talking about the idea of a milestone, these are arbitrarily set a lot of times. So it's not because you've actually finished something, it's because you might have a date that you want to see. Where is the progress, to be? If you're supposed to be 25% done with the project at this point, that could be considered a milestone. And then you base it off of that. Your project completion is at 18%. You're supposed to be at 25. Well, how far behind does that actually take you? And then that may lead to a decision on whether or not you believe, and your team believes here, whoever's actually part of it. Normally the audience is the project manager, sponsor, stakeholder, scheduler, okay, and even the project coordinator. If all those people agree that, yes, we can make this up between now and the next milestone, you may go ahead and say, hey, this actually triggers us instead to say, let's go ahead and continue. Or if nobody agrees that this can be done, then it may actually issue another type of decision, which says we might want to stop and review this before we continue forward with our progress as well. So all of them are pretty much about the same when you start hearing those terms like what Cherokee mentioned. I think I actually have it here. What do I call it? Gate reviews. I was trying to make sure I said that right. But milestones, gate reviews, go, no-go decisions, whatever you want to call it, they're pretty much kind of the same aspect and idea of what you tend to see. Okay.
All right, next up we have schedule change. So Ronnie, how does this differ between project change versus schedule change? Those terms seem pretty similar.
They really are. When it comes down to the idea of a project change, right? Normally what we're doing there is we are changing the scope or the requirement of the project.
I see.
In schedule change, though, we're actually changing the idea of the timing of when events or when tasks happen instead. Now, that's always an important factor when we start talking about a schedule change. It can involve, again, vendors in terms of contractors that you may hire, team members, stakeholders, the project manager itself, maybe even the project sponsor, if you actually do have something.
Any kind of dependent tasks.
Yep, any kind of dependent task that you have available to you. And now you actually have to be able to realize that this can affect the entirety of the schedule of the project itself. Okay? So we actually have to understand that changes in the schedule can really impact everything else, because that's the idea of working within the project constraints themselves. But we actually have to know when, where, and how much the project schedule overall is going to be affected by any type of schedule change that we make. Because this now actually means I might have to get the project coordinator to coordinate somebody else if it's a resource that needs to be replaced. I may have to actually reschedule the job if nobody's available for those dates that I originally had it planned. The project manager may have to actually go to the very point of saying that this particular schedule here indicates that we're not going to get the project done on time, and then he has to let the project sponsor know, who now makes a decision of whether or not that's acceptable or not acceptable, and what we have to do to get past it. So there's a lot of things in which a single change here can cause a very incredible rippling effect. So let's say, for example, especially in something like this on a schedule change, sounds easy enough. You delay it 1 week, no big deal. But now all of a sudden you find out that you can't get anybody to come in on the week that you've delayed it. Well, now you have to go to somebody else, and then by the time you do get it scheduled, you may find out that you don't have any money left. So you have to go all the way up to the project sponsor to see if they can actually get more money to be added into the budget at a particular point, or if you have discretionary spending that you can use for this as well. So you don't want to pad your budget, but at the same time, you don't want to use up all your discretionary spending unless you have to. And normally if you have to do that, remember that means it's gone for later on as well. So there's a lot of changes that end up happening. So realize that this is an indicator of some type of communication that also would need to go on if we have these things. And they'll happen, I'm not going to say on a daily basis, but probably close in terms of scheduling changes, because everybody has different schedules. You never know when a child is going to be sick or when you're going to be ill and you can't make it in. You never know when something actually ends up happening where you're delayed for more than you thought. Let's just say, for an example, there's a car accident, before you get to work, and it delays you for 3 hours one day. So I know I've actually been in one of those where it literally did delay me for 3 hours before I was able to get into work. and not able to start when I needed to. So just kind of realize that there are these types of things that should, again, help us and say communication needs to take place, as we continue to carry on.
All right, so next up we have task initiation or completion, however you want to word it there.
Yeah, so this is the same thing that goes on within any particular project during the execution and controlling phase, in which you will have tasks that will begin as soon as one ends, and we've talked about this in terms of task dependencies and of course in terms of task predecessors as well. Okay, so when you have something like this, essentially somebody needs to know to track and verify that this is actually done the way that it's supposed to be done here. Okay, so it helps us by assisting us in terms of scheduling, so that we know that if a task ends early, that another task can begin if it's possible. Okay, and maybe even start earlier and then possibly end earlier as well. Okay, you may find something like that out. Okay, but you may actually find out that even if you were able to end, let's say a day or two earlier, that the other team that's supposed to pick up on the succeeding task says, I know that you're finished early, but I really don't have anybody available to start my end of the project until the day I had scheduled, because I had everybody scheduled up until that point. That's fine as long as everybody understands that. Okay, if your project team members are, and leaders are actually so excited about getting stuff done early, they may find themselves in what we call a constraint here, in which they really can't do anything but wait on that particular person or vendor, contractor to finish what they actually have. So here you do have to take a look at when stuff begins and when it ends, and then keep track of that and make sure that everybody understands. Even though everything's finished early, and you might be wondering, like, why are we sitting around here? There's good reason for it, and communicating that is going to be key so that everybody understands what's happening.
Great, Ron. It looks like we have stakeholder changes. Stakeholder changes up next.
Yeah. Now, this shouldn't happen very often, okay, but it can when you have people that are switching out. So let's take for an example, I think I used this in a previous episode, that there's a vendor that you go, I want to work with this guy, okay? And they go, look, it's fine, but I'm retiring from the business and I've essentially sold this out to this guy, okay? Well, remember that when a change like that happens, whoever you had confidence in doing that job before, you may not have confidence in now doing it now.
True story. I had a midwife retire on me, and when I went into labor, the greenhorn was on duty.
There you go. Yeah, and so in that sense, right, in a very real project sense there, you.
Is it bad that I think of labor as a project?
Well, it really is when it comes down through everything that we're talking about here. But yes, this needs to be communicated, okay, because people don't understand, like if your team is used to working with that team specifically, and now they bring on new people, it's going to be a little bit harder for them to integrate in. Most of the time, everything's fine. But if a stakeholder changes, okay, such as something like that, everybody needs to have that understanding that has changed, and they'll be able to fulfill whatever they need to. But let's say it's actually like and it should never happen with the project sponsor. But let's say at this point, though, it's one of our stakeholders that's not really integrated into the project itself. But let's say that they're a big financial contributor toward the project. When that changes, yes, everybody needs to know, because we might find out something that we can't even go on with the project. You might show up in the morning and realize something, oh yeah, they've canceled that project. So make sure everybody understands that stakeholder changes are essential here, okay? Because they'll be directly affecting the teams that actually are in place as they continue to do their project.
And here we see that term, gate reviews.
Yeah, the same thing that we've talked about before, right? We want to mention it for the sake of completeness here, but it's the same as what we talked about in milestones here. Gate reviews are on-purpose reviews, okay, that say whether we're going to proceed with it or not. Milestones, they can be go and no-go decision times, okay? But a lot of times those are really marking progress of where you should be, and you may actually have that same decision there. But sometimes, though, you need to actually have it, like, understand what is the point of no return, okay? So at some particular point, you might go, look, we're so close to the end, we need to finish this, or we're so close to the end, but we're not accomplishing anything. You make a decision based on things like that as well. So even if you actually expend a lot of the income or a lot of the money for that project, you might find that you still have these different gate reviews that tell us that, okay? So in this one, the audience is going to be the project manager, usually the stakeholders, and even the project sponsor here. They're going to be a part of making that decision and helping us at specific points in which they've already said that needs to happen so that they can review this. So usually you might find them on a quarterly basis. You might find them based arbitrarily along the way, or based on what happens after the first 10 tasks. We're going to review and see whether or not we want to continue on. We can even do stuff like that. But overall, though, very essential that everybody understands that at any time that the project could be, again, stopped, okay, if necessary, based on what this review happens. So it actually does help people out when you start doing this. Okay.
Great. The next step on our list here is business continuity response.
Yeah, now, in terms of business continuity, this is a little bit stranger in what we have in place. Now, in this sense, it is possible, okay, that, and I hope it doesn't ever happen to you, but it is possible that the project management company itself, it says, look, we're no longer in that business. We've sold out of what we have. Well, there has to be some type of business continuity. In other words, the projects that they were managing still has to be completed. Well, that's what also needs to be recognized too. So when you have a business continuity type of response that happens, right, what you're really saying at this point here is that several things might have happened. The project sponsor may not be available anymore for one reason or another, okay? So, you know, God forbid, but let's say that the project manager dies, okay? Well, you get a new project manager on hand, there has to be some type of continuity to that. And so everybody needs to understand who the authority runs through and who they're going to rely on to help get them through this as well, okay? So there's a lot of this that helps to demonstrate, at least for the entire project team itself, right, that leadership is still leading even in absence of the direct leader that you might have been as a project manager or whoever it was. I shouldn't put it on you. That's a bad example. But you can kind of get the idea here, okay? Is that business continuity, again, it should trigger something that says, let's let the entire team know, here is Cherokee's going to be heading up this new project, and we need to make sure that we give the support that we need to. And, you know, and that's what we also want to make sure of as well.
And another type of incident that we really don't want to happen, but it may, would be any kind of, we need to address triggers that are associated with incident responses.
Yeah, there's no doubt that, what in the world are we talking about in terms of instances? Well, a lot of times it's an accident that may happen. It could be some type of emergency event, but usually a lot of times it is when our project itself does not meet compliance standards that are out there. And now what we want to do is we want to be able to communicate that and get us back on track. So instead of us trying to decide whether or not it's something we need to address, what we do in terms of an incident type of response is this, is that once it's actually raised to the level of an incident, we automatically communicate, here is the plan that we are going to respond with, and here's what needs to happen at this particular point in our project. This should be one of those automatic, habitual types of communication, not the idea of guessing whether or not it actually is something, okay? So, or what we're supposed to do. So at this point, that's why it is also considered a trigger. An incident response needs to actually, trigger for us at least the idea that we are going to respond appropriately and we're going to actually respond according to a plan, and that's what makes this happen too. So normally when we have this, remember, again, it's still project manager, project sponsor, who's going to be the audience the majority of the time. And then at that point, also people that will be implementing on the technical side. If it's a compliance type of implementation, managerial implementation, we have to make sure that all those are actually in place and the response is appropriate. Okay?
All right. We've almost made it through the list here. Last up, we have resource changes.
Yeah, just like we've talked about in terms of business continuity a little bit, right? When a resource change happens, this can be something that's devastating depending on the resource itself, okay? If now all of a sudden you can't get everything that you needed to, okay, from this one vendor, even though they swore that they could do it, well, now you have to rely on another one. Have you tested the quality? You may not have tested the quality at all. You may just say, it looks the same, let's just go ahead and run with it, okay? Well, that can trigger something that may not be good for your particular project here. So all the time when there, or anytime, not all the time, anytime when there is a resource change throughout the entire project itself, okay, we must make sure that everybody that's involved in part of that, using that resource, is going to understand what has happened and why you chose to go through this, okay? Now, if you don't, okay, and somebody now implements whatever this piece of cloth or whatever it is that you implement in, and now it starts tearing up machinery, well, now you have a bigger explanation to make. So usually what you want to do, of course, is that when you have some type of resource change, you want to make sure that it runs through some testing before you actually really do implement it out there to have it do that. So a resource change normally triggers for us some type of testing or some type of, quality assurance that we have to go through to make sure that everything is going to be up to par in everything that we do. So all of these are that type of, when we start talking about events and different issues here, all of these triggers really should lead to some type of process in terms of communication, letting everybody know what's going on.
Well, Ronnie, it looks like we made it through a dozen different types of communication triggers. So, guys, when you're studying out there, just make sure you're able to recognize them and identify them for the exam. I think that's about it for this episode. Stay tuned. We have more Project Plus coming your way. I'm Cherokee Boos.
And I'm Ronnie Wong.
Signing off. Have a great one.
Thank you for watching IT Pro TV.